I chose to do my research paper on the history of the automotive industry. The best place to start with that is with Henry Ford. Henry Ford created the Model T, and he created the assembly line. He is the reason we know cars the way we do today. He is the start of why we know cars the way we do. He made the Model T cheap and available to the average everyday man. Anybody could go out and buy one. It wasn't just for the rich. Between 1913 and 1927, he sold 16.5 million units of this car. 16.5 million Model Ts were created. By today's standards, that is still the 8th most sold car in the world. Number one being the Toyota Camry. But around 1927, people were aggravated with Model Ts being the only car. That was the only thing you could get. That was the only thing that you could look at. Was Model Ts. So in the 1930s, when General Motors and Chrysler came along with visually prettier cars and better looking cars, and General Motors had the first ever automatic transmission, people started walking away from the Model T. They started getting away from Henry Ford and looking at this new stuff. You know, cars that were prettier and much more luxurious for the 1930s. That being said, going into the 40s, we hit World War II. World War II was massive. It was the whole world, not just the automotive industry, stopped. And it was all about the war efforts. The car industry in the United States halted. It ceased. There was no new cars designed. There was no new releases. There wasn't cars being sold. There wasn't cars being made. The only way car manufacturers could even keep their companies alive was by creating ammunitions and planes and vehicles for the war. Everything was war efforts. The only thing manufacturers were allowed to do was a little bit of advertisement for after the war. We'll be back. We'll be back. We'll be back. And people waited and waited and waited. And in 1947, car manufacturers came back, and they came back fighting. The 1950s, it was all about performance. We had V8s and high horsepower. We had more power, more speed. The 1955, 56, 57 Bel Airs, oh, beautiful, beautiful cars. And at this point, cars are getting faster. They're getting faster. They have more horsepower, and people are loving it, loving the noise and the growl of an American V8. Going into the 60s, we've seen the release of the pony car. In 1964, Ford released the Mustang. It was a little itty-bitty two-door coupe car with a big motor. And it was great. It handled well, it was fast, it looked good, and people loved it. And shortly after, followed the Camaro, the Javelin, and the Plymouth Barracuda. And Mazda started playing with the Wankel rotary engine, which used triangles instead of pistons. It's still one of the coolest engines today because the Wankel rotary, it can turn up to 12 to 13,000 RPMs, whereas a LS V8 can only turn about 6,000. And going into the 70s, we had the 1973 oil crisis. So these V8s, the big high horsepower stuff, nobody wanted it. So the imports started to take over because the imports were already working on low gas mileage and reliability and smaller compact cars. U.S. manufacturers tried to keep up with the imports with the Japanese and the with the Japanese, the Mazdas, the Nissans, the Yeah. The U.S. released the Ford Pinto, the AMC Gremlin, which it was an okay car, and Chevrolet released the Vega. So, the U.S. wasn't doing very well in car production, but now going into the 80s, it was all about the imports. All about the imports. Toyota released their luxury brand Lexus. Nissan was right behind them with their luxury brand Infiniti. It was the 80s was the birth of the supercar. Ferrari produced a production car that hit 200 miles per hour. Over 200 miles per hour. It hit 202. It was the 1987 Ferrari F40. And at the same time, Lamborghini was working on the Countach, which is still one of the most visually pleasing cars to this day. The 80s also saw the birth of the JDM, the Japanese distribution market. It created this whole new pop culture. Everyone would love these JDM cars, these Hondas, the Nissans, the Toyotas. Everybody wanted them. They had fuel injection, so you didn't have to rely on a carburetor in the cold to get your car started. The fuel injection was just so much more reliable, and it took out all of these moving parts of a carburetor. And today, you don't see a carburetor on a new car. It's all about fuel injection. And then we get into the 90s. The 90s, we see, the 90s is probably one of the best previous generations for cars. We have disc brakes, turbochargers, superchargers, double wishbone suspension, aftermarket support from companies that are creating parts for performance. We have 4 cylinders, V6s, V8s, V10s, V12s, flat 4s, which are horizontally opposed 4 cylinders, all-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, and front-wheel drive. There was literally something for everybody in the automotive industry at this point. The 90s was brilliant. The cars were great. The cars are still good, even by today's standards. Saab released their turbo coupe. Its 0 to 60 time was 8.8. That's still impressive by today's standards. And that puts us at today, modern cars. The modern car, the modern family car, it's just 4 doors of comfort. And it's quiet. You get stuff like the Nissan Altima or the BMW 7 Series. They're quiet. And they go down the road. They're good on gas. And they look good. And I mean, performance-wise, you look at cars like the Porsche 918 or the McLaren P1. The McLaren P1 has 905 horsepower with a hybrid system. It runs half on a gasoline engine and half on an electric engine. And together they produce 905 horsepower. The suspension on the P1 is adaptive and it learns. So if you go through the same corner 3 times, you'll go through that same corner faster every time, because the suspension knows I can let the body roll over just a little bit more. I can drop the wing just this much to give you a little bit more speed. It's crazy what cars are capable of now. The Alfa Romeo Giulia, that's a 4-door family car that just released in the States. And it has a splitter on the front of it, and the flaps move up and down based on how fast you're going to help with better downforce. Cars today are great, performance-wise, luxury-wise, safety-wise. We have front airbags, rear airbags, side airbags. Back to the McLaren P1. In the GT1 class in Europe, it doesn't require a roll cage because the carbon fiber skeleton of the car is greater than the necessary standards to be a race car. Chevrolet just released the new Corvette ZR1. It's producing, now this is a street legal car. It's supercharged, and it's producing 765 horsepower. That 765 horsepower. A 98 Honda Civic, brand new off the lot, has 100 even. Cars have gone such a long way. In 1913, when the Model T was released, the top speed was 15, maybe 16 miles per hour. Now we're talking cars. The Bugatti Veyron, 252 miles per hour. Cars that go from 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds. That's the Hennessy Venom. Does that in 2.8 seconds, 0 to 60. Cars is a culture. Cars are in your everyday life. Whether you know how to work on cars, whether you know about cars, whether you're very knowledgeable or not, you, at some point in your life, most likely will own a car. And you're not going to pick something, oh, just because it has 4 wheels and an engine. You're going to go through and you're going to find something that you like to look at. You're going to go, oh, this is a pretty car, or I like the way this one sounds, or I like the seats in this one. There's a car for everyone, and cars are constantly changing, and the new technologies that we're coming up with and the stuff that is still being designed, I can only wait and see.